Well, hello and welcome to the fourth in this series of thoughts helping us to prepare for Easter Sunday. On the first one of these, we looked at Jesus' prophetic entry into Jerusalem on a donkey. The second one, we looked at Jesus turning over the tables in the temple. And the third one was the parable of the tenants in the vineyard, all of which exposed the corruption of the leadership in the temple and undermined the concept of a militaristic Messiah coming rather than Jesus, who came in peace and totally non-violently. The temple was not just the religious center of Jerusalem. You know, we often think in our own society of religious buildings, secular buildings, workplaces, and so on. The temple was the center, was the heartbeat of Jewish society. And the temple in Jerusalem was top dog temple. And there, everything that was about the life of the Jews went on. So yes, the religious and the worship, but also the social and the political and the economic life of society all went on in the temple. So when we see references to the temple, we're not just talking about the religious aspects of life. And when we're talking about people who run the temple, they didn't just run the worship and the religious ceremonies. They ran the social, political, and economic life of the city, as well as the worship and religious. So today we're looking at a passage, Mark 12, verse 35 through to verse 3 or possibly 4 of chapter 13, which you wouldn't normally see in your everyday Bible as one sort of story. We have these little headings that interrupt scripture, which in this case are totally unnecessary. They in fact have a negative effect because we don't see the links in passages. So let me show you what I mean. I always have trouble with this first slide, don't I? There we go. We have 38 to 40, which is at the end of a passage. So I could have included a lot more, but the end of the passage where Jesus is having a go, being critical of the scribes in the temple, how they like to lord it over people. And particularly he refers in verse 40 to devouring the houses of widows and praying lengthy prayers for the sake of appearance. And then we have the section 41 to 44, which is where Jesus compares the giving of rich people and the giving of a poor widow. And then we have chapter 13 beginning, the first 4 verses. I mean, really, it's only the first 3, but it makes sense to include verse 4. The first 4 verses of chapter 13, which enable us to show how these are all linked. Let me show you what I mean. In that first third of this passage, you see a reference to the scribes devouring the houses of widows. And in the second section, 41 to 44, we hear the story of a poor widow who puts in all she has, 2 small coins, compared to what the rich people are throwing in. Now that middle section is often used to say, isn't it wonderful? This widow was giving everything she had to God. She didn't spare one of the coins. She didn't tithe. She just gave everything, which is a lovely example, but not the point. The point is, in the context of the first section, it is another illustration of way those who ran the temple and benefited from everything it did had set up a system whereby this widow felt she had to give everything she had. Because after all, the money she was putting in was not going to go towards the work of the kingdom or the work of God. It was going to line the pockets of the rich and powerful who ran the temple. And in the first section, the reference to devouring the houses of widows was the fact that when a woman became a widow, her husband dies, the scribes were obliged to step in and take over whatever property had been left and manage it for the widow. But of course, they did this for a fee, and they manipulated the way the rest of the estate was used. So really, they devoured the inheritance that a widow might have received from a husband dying. And here in the second section, the rich and the powerful were throwing money in and getting all the adulation, but this widow felt she had to put everything in to be seen to be doing it, having been told to do it. And those 2 pennies would line the pockets of the scribes. Yeah. So there's a link between these passages that Jesus is pointing out the way in which those who ran the life of the city, really, for the Jews, were exploiting the poor and particularly widows and orphans. And we know throughout the Bible, God's special concern for widows and orphans. Time and time again in the Old Testament, he prioritized the looking after widows and orphans. And here Jesus is pointing out that in reality, that is not happening. Far from it. They are suffering worse than anybody else who is on the poverty line. And then there's another word that crops up in the middle section and in the final section. In verse 41, we read, and he, that's Jesus, and he sat down opposite the contribution box and was observing. And in the beginning of chapter 13, in verse 3, and he, that is Jesus, was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. Now, the word in the Greek for opposite is kaitananti, which means facing, which indicates in biblical terms judgment. So if we go back, Jesus is sitting in judgment on the way people are giving. And in verse 13, he's sitting in judgment of what's happening in the temple. And once more, as he did with the turning over the tables, is prophesying the downfall of the building 30 years later when the Romans came and razed it to the ground. Once again, he is upsetting the authorities, not just the religious authorities, but the authorities, the Jewish authorities who control every aspect of the social, political, economic, and religious life of the city. And we learn from this that if we are disciples of Jesus, we are not to hesitate to challenge corruption in our own society, to challenge inequality throughout the world, because God will be sitting opposite us, watching what we're doing. So to quote Peter, who then can be saved? Well, tomorrow we'll talk a bit about that. But we have to realize our responsibilities, not to go on a guilt trip, but to realize our responsibilities of all that Jesus is teaching in this Easter week.